What can actually happen if I don't carry workers' compensation insurance? Well, this is a question that we've received a lot in the past year, specifically in light of new legislation passed in California and similar legislation being looked at right now on the federal level. Workers' compensation insurance coverage is one of the few coverages that is required to have by law. Most states require businesses to have some form of workers' compensation insurance coverage. So what can actually happen if your business doesn't carry workers' comp coverage? That's coming up on this episode of the How Insurance Works podcast right now.
Welcome to the How Insurance Works podcast. The content in this podcast should not be considered insurance advice and is for general informational purposes only. Insurance forms and endorsements vary based on insurance company, changes in addition dates, regulations, court decisions, and state jurisdiction. So please consult your agent for further advice. And now back to How Insurance Works with Mike McGilvery.
Welcome to the How Insurance Works podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If we have not yet met here, my name is Mike McGilvery. I'm a second-generation licensed property and casualty insurance agent and broker at Shaw Moses Mendenhall & Associates in Southern California. My goal is simply to help educate and inform on various aspects of insurance and the insurance industry so you can make better informed decisions. What can really happen to me if I don't carry workers' compensation insurance for my business? This is a question that we've been hearing a lot lately, as I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, and it's been complicated by recent legislation in California, especially, and similar legislation that's now being discussed on the federal level. Now, none of this is particularly a pleasant topic to talk about, but I'm going to answer the question directly in this podcast and just simply convey how things are. What could potentially happen to you if your business doesn't carry workers' compensation insurance? Now, of course, there's cost considerations to workers' comp insurance. We're certainly all sensitive to that at our firm, and frankly, the legislation, especially in California, couldn't have come at a worse time with so many businesses struggling as the result of a pandemic. But first, a little bit of background. Workers' compensation insurance, as many know, provides coverage for your business if one of your employees is injured on the job while working or gets sick or ill on the job while working, and that includes contracting COVID-19. We're going to go into more detail on workers' compensation insurance coverage on a separate podcast, but this is one of the few coverages that is required by law to have. Most states require businesses to have some form of workers' compensation insurance coverage. But what's complicated things recently is legislation, especially in California, called AB5. Now, this legislation has required many businesses to reclassify 1099 independent contractors as W-2 employees. These are situations where previously these were 1099 independent contractors. So classifying them as W-2 employees means now they have to buy into unemployment insurance, they have to pay payroll tax, and these businesses that have to reclassify their independent contractors as W-2 employees, of course, now have to get workers' compensation insurance coverage, and in some cases where they didn't need to have it before. A similar legislation is being discussed at the federal level. It was formerly called the PRO Act. Now, that didn't go anywhere, but it was recently reintroduced as Bill H.R. 842. And if this passes again on the federal level, many more businesses may have to purchase workers' compensation insurance. To directly address what can happen if your business doesn't have workers' compensation, I'm going to use California as an example. That's the state that I work in, but check with your own state laws that govern workers' compensation. They are all a little bit different. I'm just going to use California here as an example in this podcast. And to be clear, this recent legislation in California, AB5, it passed in January of 2020. It isn't imposing any new workers' compensation fines or penalties. What we're going to talk about here are fines and penalties that were already in California Labor Code 3700. So AB5 didn't add any new penalties or fines. Now with AB5, businesses had from January to July of 2020 to reclassify employees, any 1099 independent contractors that now need to be W-2 employees. They had from January to July to reclassify them, and in July of 2020, they had to make sure a workers' compensation insurance plan was in place. If you are a business owner in California, and if you do have questions about how AB5 might affect your business, please reach out to a good employment attorney. If you need a little help, I have some great colleagues that specialize in AB5. They're employment attorneys. Reach out to me at mikemack@howinsuranceworks.co. I would be happy to be a resource and help you out. Now, with workers' compensation in California, there was a rumor circulating for a long time that if you don't have workers' comp insurance, really you'd be levied a $10,000 fine and you could perhaps spend up to a year in jail. But spending up to a year in jail wasn't that likely. It was really more about the fine. Part of that's true, but there are things that happened before that that many aren't aware of. Now, again, this isn't a pleasant topic to address because the penalties can actually be more serious in California for not having workers' compensation. Now, all of this information in the podcast, this is coming directly from my conversation over the phone with the California Department of Industrial Relations Labor Board. So everything is coming direct from them. And in California, workers' compensation penalties and fees are levied and administered by the California Department of Industrial Relations Labor Board and the Bureau of Field Enforcement Unit. I spoke directly also with an agent that works for the Bureau of Field Enforcement Unit. And what this Bureau of Field Enforcement Unit does is they conduct random industry sweeps, random company inspections, and they will also pursue a company for failure to carry workers' compensation insurance if they're notified by a whistleblower. A whistleblower being an employee of the company, perhaps an attorney of an employee that got injured, and a competitor of that business. According to the agent that I spoke with, it's often a competitor of the business that finds out they don't have a workers' compensation insurance plan and can potentially blow the whistle, which was interesting to hear directly from them. Now, the goal of this unit, it's not to pursue failure to carry workers' compensation as a criminal matter. They're just trying to impose initial penalties to encourage a company to get workers' compensation insurance if they don't already have it. So they're simply trying to encourage the company, unfortunately by way of fees and penalties, but they're trying to encourage the company to put workers' compensation insurance in place. So here are the initial penalties. Again, this is coming directly from an agent at the Bureau of Field Enforcement Unit. If they do a random sweep, or if they find out that you don't have work comp coverage, upon inspection, they'll impose an immediate stop order right on the spot during inspection, which means they can shut your business down until you get a workers' comp policy. No employee labor can continue until that company purchases a workers' compensation policy and has it in force. And during this time, employers have to continue to pay employee salaries for time lost, up to 10 days. So that's number one. Number two, besides the inspection and a possible shutdown, there's also, of course, a fine that goes along with this, and that fine is $1,500 fine per employee that was employed during the uninsured period. So if you hadn't been insured for 2 or 3 years, that is a $1,500 fine per employee, all of the employees that were employed in that 2 to 3 year period. If that number's uncertain, we're not quite sure how many employees we employed during that uninsured period, then their answer to that is they're going to levy a fine, and it could be a substantial fine, based on the number of employees you have during the inspection. So as an example, if you have 20 employees during an inspection at $1,500 per employee, that's $30,000. So that is a heavy, heavy fee to be levied. Now, they also could decide we're not going to levy that fee on you, but what's easier for us and what makes more sense is you should have had workers' compensation coverage. You should have been paying a premium for that coverage. Well, rather than impose a $1,500 fine per employee, we're just going to have you pay the premium that you should have been paying for work comp insurance, and we're going to multiply that by 2. So you're going to have to pay double the premium you would have had to pay if you had a workers' comp policy. So that's the first step. The Bureau of Field Enforcement Unit first tries to encourage you, and I know encourage is a weird word to use here, but they're trying to encourage companies to get a workers' comp policy by either shutting the business down and imposing one of those 2 fines, $1,500 per employee, or the premium you should have paid times 2 during the time you didn't have work comp insurance. That's their first effort. Now, if that first effort isn't successful, and the Bureau of Field Enforcement isn't successful in encouraging a company to get work comp insurance, then they refer the case to the district attorney, and the district attorney is free to pursue the matter as a criminal offense pursuant to California Labor Code 3700.5, which stipulates that failure to carry workers' compensation insurance could result in imprisonment in county jail for a year or a fine of up to or double the amount of premium that should have been paid, but not less than $10,000. And it's this, when it goes to the DA, this is where the rumor that, well, if you don't have work comp insurance, it's a possible year in jail and a $10,000 fine. This is where that comes from. It's after the Bureau of Field Enforcement Unit does their job. And if they can't do their job and the company doesn't get work comp insurance, this is when they refer the case to the DA. So the rumor that kind of circulates about, well, it's a $10,000 fine and a potential year in jail, that's at the point that it gets to the DA. But prior to that, the Bureau of Field Enforcement Unit is going to levy their penalties and their fines. So once it gets to the DA has a few choices on what penalty that they can levy. And again, it could be they could agree to say, yes, we want you to pay double the amount of premium that you could have paid. They can fine you up to $100,000. So that is what can happen. Now, what about a situation? Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. In the case that an employee is injured on the job and the company doesn't have workers' comp insurance, well, that case could very well end up in front of the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board, or the WCAB, and that's part of the Department of Industrial Relations. Now, what happens in that case? You have an employee injured at work. He's expecting workers' comp to help pay for him, but he doesn't have it. Likely he's going to hire an attorney. Now, if it's found that that case is non-compensable, in other words, if it's found that, well, it wasn't a work-related injury, it wasn't a work-related sickness, maybe they got hurt on the weekend, and it actually is determined that nothing happened at work, they can still levy a fine against your company, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board. So if it's not a legitimate case, they can still impose a penalty of $2,000 per employee employed at the time of the claim. If the case is legitimate, if it's compensable, that employee really did get injured at work and there's no workers' compensation insurance, then the WCAB can impose a fine of $10,000 per employee that was employed at the time that that employee claimed the injury. The employer and the business, in addition to these fines, can also face a civil suit from the injured employee, and likely will, and the employer may be required to pay all of the medical expenses for the injured employee out of pocket. This is why I say this is not a pleasant topic to address, but this simply is the way that it goes, and it's addressing the reality of the situation. Again, all of this comes direct from the California Department of Industrial Relations Labor Board. So what can we do about this? There's a lot of insurance companies out there that do an exceptional job with workers' compensation. In this situation, it's an advantage to work with an independent agent or broker. If you find out you need workers' compensation or you don't have it and you're worried about cost, because of course we understand cost is a consideration here, it's an advantage to work with an independent agent or broker. They're simply going to have access to more workers' compensation insurance carriers, and it's nice to try to canvass the market, approach as many companies, or have that agent approach as many companies on your behalf as they can. Each insurance company charges different rates for different classes of employees, for different job descriptions. Now, it may be a little harder if you're a first-year business. A lot of insurance companies won't always write a first-year business, or even if you're not a first-year business, you're first year to them because you haven't had workers' compensation insurance before. So a lot of companies won't write workers' comp the first time for you, but if you can carry it for a year or 2 or 3 years, build up a little bit of history, then your options open up with other markets and other companies that you can approach. So certainly work with an independent agent or broker. They simply have access to more companies that offer workers' compensation insurance. Again, if you're a business owner in California and you have questions about how AB5 might be affecting your business, speak with a good employment attorney that specializes in AB5. If you need a little help there, I have a few fantastic colleagues that are very, very good with it. They specialize in AB5. I'd be happy to help you out. You can reach out to me directly at mikemack@howinsuranceworks.co. So again, not a pleasant topic, but I hope that podcast was helpful. If you have a what-if situation for us, let us know. Visit us. Howinsuranceworks.co is our website. You can find our email on the website and email us from there, and we may feature your question on the next podcast. You can find our social media links on howinsuranceworks.co. And again, to reach me directly, feel free to email me at mikemac@howinsuranceworks.co. That's mikemac@howinsuranceworks.co. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you on the next one.